This video is sponsored by Aura. More on them a little later. On a spring evening in 1999, a man walked up to a payphone in Multnomah County, Oregon. He picked up the handset, dialed the number on the keypad, and waited for the call to connect. However, after letting it ring just a single time, he immediately hung up. This wasn't any kind of accident. That call had been made to a specific unit in a nearby apartment building, and the woman who lived there knew exactly what it meant. The single ring was a code to let her know the man was coming. A few minutes later, this woman got a knock at the door, which she immediately opened up. However, when she did, she would receive the surprise of her life. You see, what she and the man at the payphone hadn't realized was that they were being watched. In order to understand who was watching them and why, though, we have to rewind 6 weeks. That's when someone else had been on the receiving end of a surprise. One that, as you'll see, was far more disturbing. To pretty much everyone who knew them, the Exum family seemed like they had everything in life figured out. The family of 6 lived in a spacious, split-level home in the Portland suburb of Gresham, Oregon. They were well respected by their friends and neighbors, and they were deeply involved in their local community. At the core of the family were husband and wife Bill and Carolyn Exum, who had just about as all-American a love story as you could imagine. They both grew up in the Portland area and had met while they were attending Sandy Union High School in 1978. Bill was in his senior year at the time and was your prototypical all-star student athlete. Over 6 feet tall, well-built, quarterback of the high school football team. You get the idea. Carolyn, on the other hand, was a freshman, though she ran with a pretty popular crowd herself. She was a cheerleader and was known for her bubbly, upbeat, and infectious energy. Bill graduated 3 years before Carolyn, but the high school sweethearts managed to keep their romance alive. While Carolyn was finishing up at Sandy Union High, Bill attended Clackamas County College and graduated from a place called Computer Career Institute. During this time, he also worked on a farm in the city of Boring, located a short drive east of Portland. The pair were married in 1983, not long after Carolyn graduated from high school. Within a couple of years, Bill had gotten a good job with Consolidated Freightways, a transport and logistics company that was well known in the area at the time. He would eventually work his way up to becoming a supervisor there, though in the meantime, the job allowed him and Carolyn to settle down and start their family. Over the next several years, they would welcome 4 children into the world, 3 sons and 1 daughter. After moving to their home in Gresham, the Exums quickly became a staple of the community, particularly at their church, the Mount Hood Christian Center. Carolyn taught preschool and kindergarten classes there, and Bill, who was very religious, would even serve as a sort of mentor to people in the congregation who were struggling. What people really admired about the Exums, though, was how their children seemed to be at the forefront of everything they did. They would sign them up for every sport and activity you could think of, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, with 4 kids was quite hectic. But then on top of that, they also tried to get involved as well. Carolyn was that mom that was always driving everyone around in the family minivan, while Bill, of course, being the former high school athlete, was first in line to coach all of his kids' baseball and soccer teams. It was for all of these reasons and more that when the Exum family were the victims of a sudden and violent tragedy in the spring of 1999, no one could believe it. It began when police received a late-night 911 call.
This message is for you from the Criminal Investigation Department of Revenue Canada. The reason behind this call is to notify you
hey,
that we have
didn't see you there. I was just listening to my voicemails, and as per usual, I've got 10 new robocalls from Canada Revenue. Looks like I owe them thousands of dollars again, and for some reason, they want me to pay them in gift cards. Seems legit, right? Yeah, I don't think so either. All jokes aside, as much as this particular scam might seem painfully obvious, criminals are using it and others like it for a reason. They work, and what's worse, not all of them are this unsophisticated. It brings up a good question, though. How are scammers getting your and my information in the first place? Unfortunately, in our increasingly digital age, information like your full name, email, home address, and even your health records are becoming easier and easier to find online. Luckily, that's where Aura, the sponsor of today's video, comes in. Aura helps protect your personal information from being sold on the dark web and by data brokers. They alert you if your data is compromised and automatically opt you out of data broker websites to help keep your information out of the wrong hands. This is more important than ever, especially with data breaches like the recent AT&T incident where over 73 million customer records were leaked on the dark web. Aura provides all-in-one protection, monitoring your credit, offering fraud alerts, and even helping you secure your online accounts with a password manager. With Aura always working in the background to help keep your information safe, you can focus on the things that matter to you, knowing you have that extra layer of security. I know I definitely value my privacy, and if you're looking to step up yours too, right now Aura is offering a free 2-week trial to Crime Zone viewers. Head over to aura.com/crimezone or check out the link below to get your free trial and start securing your personal information today.
911. We need police. My neighbor's here. She's got blood all over her husband's laying full of blood in their house. Somebody broke in. They've got 4 kids in the house upstairs. Okay, stay on the line and keep her there. We're going to get the police started right now.
The 911 call you just heard came in at 12:41 a.m. on March 21st, 1999. It was made by a neighbor of the Exum family who said that something terrible had taken place inside their home. This neighbor wasn't exactly sure what had happened, but she said it seemed like some sort of home invasion. Carolyn had run over, obviously injured and covered in blood, and was saying something about how she and Bill had been attacked. When police arrived in the neighborhood located on Southeast Tibbetts Court, they found a crowd of people gathered on the street outside. Several were tending to Carolyn, who was holding a towel to a wound on her head. She was frantic and was saying that her children were still inside. Before doing anything else, officers made their way into the residence. Thankfully, all 4 of the Exum children were unharmed and still asleep in their beds. They were brought outside to safety while officers continued to clear the rest of the house, and emergency responders had a look at Carolyn's injuries. At the same time, investigators began to speak to her about what had happened. Carolyn said that she had been preparing to go to bed that night when she heard loud noises from downstairs. Specifically, a bunch of banging noises, ones that sounded like they were coming from the garage. Bill had a little makeshift office space in their 2-car garage, and it wasn't uncommon for him to be down there late into the evening finishing up a bit of work. However, Carolyn said she was immediately put on edge by these banging sounds because nothing Bill ever did down there made this kind of noise. Unnerved by what she was hearing, Carolyn decided to check to make sure everything was okay. When she opened the adjoining door to the garage from the house, at first she didn't see much of anything. Part of this had to do with the fact that there was a lot of stuff in there, though it was mostly because Bill's little office nook area was kind of tucked away on the far side of the room. You had to actually walk through most of the garage to get there, and it wasn't until Carolyn did this that she said she discovered what she had been hearing. Bill had been attacked and was lying in a pool of blood next to his desk. Carolyn explained that she tried her best not to panic and immediately got down onto the floor to see if Bill was still breathing and to help him in whatever way she could. What she hadn't realized, though, was the person who did this was still there. As she was desperately trying to tend to her husband, she was hit hard with something in the head. The blow was powerful enough that it sent her into a daze and had even momentarily knocked her out. Carolyn said she wasn't sure how long she had been incapacitated for, but as soon as she got her bearings back, she ran straight out of the garage and went to get help. When paramedics had a look at Carolyn's head wound, it seemed to match with what she was saying. The injury wasn't life-threatening or anything, but it was clear she'd taken a solid blow and would need to be at least briefly hospitalized for stitches as well as further examination. Unfortunately, the situation with Bill Exum was a lot more grim. When police made their way into the garage, they found the 39-year-old father of 4 dead on the concrete floor of his home office. The scene was nothing short of brutal. Bill's body was lying sort of half in and half out of the office area, and it was obvious the majority of the attack had been targeted at his head. An autopsy would later reveal that Bill had been struck at least 11 times with some sort of blunt object. These hits had been so vicious that they had completely destroyed his skull in multiple places. Perhaps equally as disturbing as the injuries was the blood evidence. In addition to a large pool around the body, droplets and spatter were scattered all over the enclosed space. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, the piles of items and office equipment, almost everything had some amount of blood on it. Understandably, this made processing the crime scene quite a daunting task for investigators. That being said, as they carefully began working their way through the evidence, a couple of details quickly jumped out. The first detail came when detectives noticed that some of the blood spots that had been left on the walls had a clear, defined line to them. Because of Bill's injuries, they already knew that he had been killed with some sort of blunt object, but this seemed to offer a little more insight into what this object looked like. It appeared that the murder weapon was some kind of club, pipe, or piece of metal that had at least one straight edge to it. The other detail that stuck out wasn't really one thing, it was sort of a collection of little things that added up to a single conclusion. And that conclusion was that there had clearly been a real struggle inside the garage. There was an overturned chair, random items were scattered on the ground. This had been a serious fight. Part of the reason this was interesting was because with most home invasion cases, the goal is robbery or burglary. However, it didn't actually look like anything was missing from the Exum's house. As previously mentioned, Bill was also a pretty big guy who would have been capable of holding his own. To police, it didn't seem like the kind of fight you'd want to pick if you were just a random burglar. Of course, that left a much more unsettling possibility, that Bill had been specifically targeted. If that were the case, though, the next questions were obvious. Who would want to hurt Bill? And more importantly, why? While members of the forensics team continued processing the crime scene, detectives and other officers with the Gresham Police Department turned their attention towards canvassing the neighborhood. They asked residents in the area if they had seen anything unusual around the time of the murder, or if there was anyone that they could think of that might be capable of committing a crime like this. None of the people that police spoke with were able to give them any specific names, though they did point out one possible avenue for further investigation. The neighborhood was right next to a wooded area, and officers were told that homeless people had been known to live in there. Nothing too serious had ever happened before as a result of this, although occasionally residents said that they had some stuff stolen from them. Detectives were intrigued by this information. The Exum house actually backed directly onto that wooded area, so it was conceivable that this is how they had been targeted. A large and meticulous search effort was organized to go through these woods, both to look for potential suspects and to see if any additional clues could be found. Unfortunately, this ultimately came up short. While this was a setback, it wasn't exactly a huge surprise. As I said before, investigators had already started to feel like the crime probably wasn't an opportunistic burglary or robbery gone wrong. The brutal way that Bill had been murdered felt too personal to be random, and police were pushed even further in this direction when it was confirmed that there were no signs of forced entry at the crime scene. This meant that the killer had been let in willingly, or they were able to find some vulnerability at the residence that authorities weren't aware of. Either way, it suggested that the perpetrator had some level of familiarity with the Exums and their home. That being the case, detectives decided to move on to questioning those close to the family. They started with Carolyn, who spoke to investigators at the Gresham Police Department after being released from the hospital. They asked her all the standard questions. Does Bill have any enemies? Is there anyone who might have a grudge against him or the family? Stuff like that. Carolyn said that no, there really wasn't anyone like that in their lives. As far as she was aware, everyone loved and respected Bill, and there was no reason for any of this to have happened. That wasn't the only disappointing news that Carolyn had for detectives. Since she was the only real witness to the crime, Authorities had hoped that she might be able to at least provide them with some sort of description of the person who had attacked her and her husband. However, she said that she had been hit before she ever got a look at the perpetrator. The one thing Carolyn was able to provide police were the pair of jeans that she was wearing at the time of the crime, which had blood evidence on them. Investigators knew that it was a long shot that the jeans would be useful, especially since Carolyn said that she was pretty sure she got the blood on her while trying to help her husband. Still, these were sent off for testing and further analysis on the off chance that the killer's DNA was also on them. After their conversation with Carolyn, detectives continued speaking with others who were close to Bill and the Exum family. Much to their frustration, it was the same story with them as well. No one had anything bad to say about the deceased father, and all of them seemed just as shocked and confused as to how something like this could have happened. The full weight of this was driven home even more 3 days later when a memorial service was held for Bill. Friends, family, and community members came out in droves and packed the Mount Hood Christian Center. Multiple rows of pews were filled with the kids' sports teams that Bill had volunteered with, some of whom came in uniform to pay their final respects to their beloved coach. In a fitting tribute, at one point the entire church joined together to sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." Understandably, the scene was very emotional, and it was obvious to everyone present that Bill's kids were destroyed by the loss of their father. At the same time, it looked like Carolyn was doing her best to put on a brave face and keep the family together. While everyone was doing their best to grieve and process the heartbreaking loss, in the meantime, investigators had finally started to hit their first couple of real breaks in the case. This began when they decided to do another round of canvassing in the Exum's neighborhood. It's unclear if they interviewed different people this time, asked different questions, or both. But what we do know is that the second time around, police got lucky. It happened when they were tipped off about a red and silver pickup truck. A resident told detectives that they had seen this pickup truck in the neighborhood at least a few times, usually parked near the Exum's house. They thought that the truck might be important because they remembered seeing it during the day on March 20th, as well as again later that evening, only now it had moved a little ways down the road. This would have been within just a few hours of the murder. The day after receiving this lead, detectives got another tip, one that would prove to be even more important. It was from a local florist who said that they remembered something that they thought police should know about. The florist explained that a few months back they had been hired by a man to put together and deliver a bouquet of flowers. That bouquet was sent to Carolyn Exum and also included a card with quite the eye-catching message. It read, quote, "A little bit of sunshine to my best friend, with love." While the man who paid for the flowers hadn't wanted the card signed, fortunately for police, the florist had still collected his contact information. His name was Alan Browning. Things got even more interesting when police looked up Alan's name and got a look at his vehicle records. He was the owner of a silver and red Dodge pickup truck. As authorities were about to learn, though, this wasn't the only connection that Alan had to the case. It turned out that he had quite the compelling link to Bill and Carolyn Exum, one that police thought might just hint at a potential motive for murder. After connecting the tip about the pickup truck with the lead from the florist, detectives with the Gresham Police Department finally had a person of interest in the case. Of course, they also had a lot more questions. To name a few, who was Alan Browning? Why was he sending Carolyn Exum flowers? And how did he even know her and her family in the first place? When investigators began digging further into Alan's background, at first it seemed like he and the Exums had nothing in common. The Exums were a large, well-known, and very active family in the area, while Alan was a divorced father of one who worked at a print shop and lived in his parents' basement. Funny enough, it was this last detail that eventually led to the aha moment for police. It came when they found out that Alan's parents lived close to Carolyn's parents. They had grown up right near each other. In fact, Alan was the same age as Carolyn and had attended the same high school as her and Bill. This led detectives to wonder, maybe there was something going on between Carolyn and Alan. Because they still didn't really have anything concrete at this stage, investigators just decided to ask Carolyn about Alan directly. When they did, she seemed fairly open with them, but insisted that they definitely had the wrong idea. Carolyn said that her and Alan were good friends now, though that had happened in a kind of roundabout way. They technically met in high school, but they didn't know each other well back then. They hung out with totally different groups of people and socially just didn't ever really overlap. Carolyn said that only changed a couple of years ago when she ran into Alan after the blue for the first time in quite a while. They got to talking, and it was clear that Alan was going through a rough patch because of his divorce, so Carolyn invited him to her church. She also asked Bill if he would minister to Alan, essentially kind of take him under his wing spiritually speaking. Bill agreed and helped Alan to become a member of the church. As for the flower thing, Carolyn said that was Alan thanking her for helping him to get through that dark time in his life. But really, it wasn't just her and Alan that had the connection. Bill and Alan had also become friends. Following this conversation, detectives spoke with a bunch of members of the congregation at the Mount Hood Christian Center who backed up what Carolyn had told them. They said, yeah, Bill had kind of brought Alan in and was helping him to turn his life around. Though Carolyn's story seemed to check out, as far as investigators were concerned, Alan Browning was still a person of interest in the case. After all, that vehicle matching the description of his pickup truck had still been spotted near the scene around the time of Bill's murder. As a result, police turned their full attention towards Alan. It wasn't long before they came up with a new theory. This theory took shape when Gresham police were able to obtain copies of Sandy Union High School yearbooks from the time when Bill, Carolyn, and Alan were all students there. As they thumbed through the pages, an idea jumped out. As previously mentioned, Carolyn and Bill were both extremely popular in high school. Bill was the quarterback of the football team, and Carolyn was a cheerleader who always had a massive group of friends around her. Alan, by contrast, was the kind of guy that seemed to fade into the background. He was shy, geeky, and not really involved in much of anything at the school. This led detectives to wonder, maybe Alan was obsessed with Carolyn. Perhaps this had started as a crush in high school, one that had never really gone away. And then when Carolyn and Alan had reconnected a couple of years ago, maybe it had festered into something else. A second chance in Alan's mind to get the girl who had always been out of his league. This time, by any means necessary. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's a pretty wild leap to make just from some old yearbook photos. And you'd be right. But this wasn't the only thing that investigators did. They also went to speak to someone with a much better idea about Alan's personal life and his history. His ex-wife. And let's just say, she was quick to agree that police were on the right track. Alan's ex-wife told investigators that one of the main reasons that their marriage had broken up was because of his obsession with Carolyn. She always knew Alan had a thing for her, but from the time that they had reconnected, this had gone from like a high school crush to an all-consuming desire, one that Alan hadn't been shy about sharing. In fact, the woman told police that at one point she found a letter that Alan had written that was supposed to be for Carolyn, with a disturbing and heartbreaking admission in it. In the letter, Alan wrote, quote, "I can live without my son, but I cannot live without you." As truly wild as this was on its own, the ex-wife still had more to share. When asked if she thought that Alan could have had something to do with Bill's murder, right away she said, yes, definitely. The woman explained that at the time the murder took place, she and her son were on a mini vacation. When they returned home, she started to hear details about what had happened because, everyone was talking about Bill's murder. Interestingly, though, Alan never brought it up. This was despite the fact that Bill was supposed to be a close friend, someone who was ministering to him at church. Detectives asked the ex-wife about any weapons Alan might have had, and she said that there was one thing that he usually carried with him. It was a heavy piece of pipe with grip tape wrapped around one end that Alan referred to as his fishwhacker. This already sounded quite a bit like the murder weapon, but there was one final detail that was even more convincing. The pipe that the fishwhacker was made out of was square, meaning that it would have had straight edges on it, just like those left behind in the blood at the crime scene. Police asked the woman where Alan kept the fish whacker, and she replied that it was almost always in his pickup truck behind one of the seats. At this point, detectives were almost positive that they had the right suspect. However, they weren't ready to move in on Alan Browning just yet. Instead, they placed him under surveillance, hoping to find more evidence to round out their investigation. This would prove to be a critical decision. Not only would it give police valuable information, it would reveal the last remaining missing piece in the case. On the night of May 4th, 1999, so just over 6 weeks after Bill Exum's murder, a man walked up to a Multnomah County payphone and made a call. After letting it ring once, he immediately hung up and then started walking away. That man was Alan Browning, and he was headed for a nearby apartment building. He would never make it, though, because before he could get there, he was intercepted and arrested by officers from the Gresham Police Department who had been watching him now for several weeks. At the same time that this was happening, another team of officers went into the apartment building where Alan had been intending to go. After making their way to a specific unit there, they knocked on the door. Moments later, a woman opened up expectantly. It was Carolyn Exum, wearing nothing but a negligee. She was given just enough time to change into some proper clothes before she was also placed in handcuffs and taken down to the police station. It turned out that when police had started their surveillance of Alan Browning a few weeks earlier, they had also obtained warrants to put up a few cameras, mostly in areas that Alan frequented. One of these areas was a strip mall where Alan's son was enrolled in karate classes. Well, as it happened, some of the Exum children also took karate lessons there, and when detectives started reviewing the footage from their camera, they quickly noticed a pattern. Every time, Alan and Carolyn would drop off their kids before heading to Carolyn's van, where they would promptly disappear inside the vehicle for quite some time. I'll let you fill in the blanks there, but let's just say they weren't playing checkers. Of course, this in and of itself wasn't proof of any wrongdoing, though it was enough for authorities to obtain further warrants, specifically ones for wiretaps and listening devices which were set up in the apartment where Carolyn had moved with her children after Bill's murder. The resulting audio recordings from these devices not only confirmed once and for all that Alan and Carolyn were romantically involved, they also revealed a lot about the dynamics of their relationship. Specifically, that Carolyn was the one running the show. Investigators would later describe Alan as being like a puppy dog, one who was completely acting at Carolyn's beck and call to a pretty unbelievable degree. For instance, if Alan would say something and Carolyn said the opposite, Alan would just totally change his opinion and agree with her. He also did everything around her schedule. So, like that whole thing with the payphone, that was a code so that Carolyn would know Alan was coming over so that she could sneak him into the apartment when her kids were asleep. This was something police observed repeatedly during the time of the surveillance, which is how they knew they would be able to catch them by surprise during the arrests. Speaking of arrests, once Carolyn and Alan were in custody, they were brought to separate interview rooms. At first, both of them denied any wrongdoing, with Carolyn in particular sticking to her story even after being presented with evidence of her relationship with Alan. As the hours went on, though, it seemed that Carolyn began to realize that she was trapped and started changing details of what she was saying. This started small. She admitted to sleeping with Alan, but said that it had only happened after Bill's death. But the changes slowly grew larger and larger. Carolyn admitted the rest of the affair, but said she didn't know anything about the murder. Finally, she claimed that she knew Alan was behind the murder, but that she didn't say anything because she feared for the safety of her and her children. Detectives didn't buy any of this, but that wasn't really the point. You see, during his own interview, Alan said he just wanted to hear Carolyn's voice. Police obliged, allowing him to listen outside the door as Carolyn threw him under the bus for the entirety of her husband's murder. That's when Alan said he was finally ready to reveal what had really happened. Alan said that when he first reconnected with Carolyn, it seemed like a dream come true. Here was this woman who he'd been totally in love with in high school and who had always been out of his league. And now, not only was she noticing him, for the first time it seemed like she was returning his romantic interest. For months, things had gotten more and more intense between them. They were having a full-blown affair by this point, and Carolyn seemed like she was ready to go even further. She said that she wanted to be with Alan and that they should get married. They even purchased a wedding dress for her and a new ring for him. Unfortunately, Carolyn said there was a problem. According to Alan, Carolyn told him that if they were going to be together, Bill had to be out of the picture completely. Things were going to be too messy with the kids involved and everything, and on top of that, they were going to need money to start their new life together. Fortunately, Carolyn said that the payout from Bill's life insurance policy and retirement benefits would be more than $415,000. If all of this wasn't enough to convince Alan, the final thing Carolyn told him certainly got him on board. She falsely claimed that she wanted out of her marriage in the first place because Bill was abusive. Alan explained that on the night of the murder, Carolyn let him into the house, then lured Bill into the garage under the pretense of a fun, sexy little game. After taking him into his office, she tied him to a chair and put a blindfold over his eyes. That's when Alan headed in armed with his fishwhacker. Alan stated that the original plan was for him to hit Bill once by surprise, knocking him unconscious. Once he was out, they would burn down the house with him inside to make it look like an accident. However, this is not how things had played out. Bill was a big guy, and he didn't go down without a fight. As soon as he was hit, Bill managed to stand up, still strapped to the chair, at which point all hell broke loose. Alan went into a panic and started swinging the fishwhacker around wildly. He managed to get off a couple more hits, but in the struggle, the weapon flew out of his hands. At the same time, Bill's blindfold had slipped, revealing to him what was going on. He looked at Carolyn for help, but instead, she picked up the fishwhacker and handed it back to Alan. That's when Alan had finished him off. In a scene that is almost too horrifying and heartbreaking to even imagine. In Bill's final moments, he not only realized that his wife had betrayed him, he had to watch as she put the weapon that was used to murder him in the hands of his killer. Following Alan's confession, he also agreed to tell police where he had hidden the murder weapon. By this time, they had already seized and searched his truck, but the fishwhacker hadn't been inside. Alan said that he buried the item in the ground in some woods behind his parents' place and described the approximate location. During a subsequent search, the weapon was recovered. Even with all of this, Carolyn continued to deny everything. In fact, according to police, in one final act of manipulation, she even had the audacity to try and get Alan to take the fall for everything. This apparently happened when she sent him a letter in jail after their arrests, telling him that if he really loved her, he would let her go. Unfortunately for Carolyn, Alan agreed to testify against her. The testimony was bolstered by one other piece of damning evidence. Remember the jeans that Carolyn was wearing? The ones that she said she got blood on when she discovered Bill's body and tried to help him? Well, upon further analysis, it turned out that those bloodstains were from high-velocity spatter, not simple contact. This meant that Carolyn would have had to have been present when Bill was actually being killed. After agreeing to fully cooperate and testify, Alan Browning took a plea deal for Bill's murder and was given a life sentence. Despite her stubborn denials, Carolyn also eventually saw the writing on the wall and agreed to plead guilty in January of 2001. She received a sentence of life with a minimum of 25 years. I know this is far from the first story we've covered about a spousal murder on this channel, but I gotta say, this has gotta be one of the most heartbreaking and disturbing cases like this that I've ever come across. The level of betrayal is astounding enough on its own. Then you have that whole other level of manipulation with Alan Browning. I definitely think Alan still deserves to be held responsible for his actions, especially given the brutality of this particular crime. Though that being said, it's clear that Carolyn had him in the palm of her hand. You may have noticed that there's a bit of a loose end with Carolyn's head injury that she had at the time the original 911 call was made. None of the sources that we looked at offered a clear explanation for this, though if I had to guess, I'd say she either deliberately had Alan hit her to make the home invasion seem more plausible, or she was simply struck by accident when Alan was panicking and flailing the murder weapon around during the struggle. There's actually one more loose end, though, that I want to address, and this is perhaps the most chilling thing of all about this case. So, if you'll recall, in Alan's confession, he stated that the initial plan with the murder was to knock Bill unconscious and set the house on fire. Of course, you might also have remembered that the Exum's 4 children were asleep in bed at the time of the crime. This led some investigators to suspect that Carolyn's original intention wasn't just to murder Bill, but to wipe out her whole family. This is pure speculation, so take that with a grain of salt, but it's pretty dark to think about, especially because at the end of the day, there's still really no clear answer as to why Carolyn did what she did. I guess you could say greed, and that's probably true. I don't know, maybe the problem is that I'm looking for sense in the senseless. According to reports, Carolyn Exum has appealed her conviction multiple times over the years, as well as applied for clemency seeking early release. These attempts have been opposed by all 4 of her children, most recently in 2022. That being said, Carolyn is eligible for parole as of this year, and in fact, may have already quietly been released. While we were able to find inmate records for Alan Browning on Oregon's Department of Corrections website, a search for Carolyn's name returned no results. Before we wrap up, we just wanted to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. As always, we hope you found today's story interesting and informative. A huge thanks as well to today's sponsor, Aura. Don't forget to check out the link in the description below to get your 2-week free trial. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.